The arrow struck the tree an inch from Nathaniel Hawke's head, and he did not even flinch. He turned his horse in one smooth motion, his pale eyes already scanning the ridge above the narrow forest road, counting the shapes moving between the trees before his own soldiers had even finished shouting the alarm. 6 riders, maybe 7, coming down fast from the eastern slope, exactly where his scouts had promised the road was clear. "Ambush," he said calmly, drawing his sword as easily as another man might draw a breath. "Shields up. Hold the center." Around him, 12 soldiers of the Draymore Royal Guard scrambled into formation, horses wheeling and stamping on the frozen ground, breath fogging in the cold morning air. Nathaniel did not raise his voice. He never needed to. Even now, with arrows raining down through bare branches and men shouting on every side, his soldiers moved, because his calm alone told them exactly what to do. He was a giant of a man, well over 6.5 feet tall, built with the kind of raw, dense strength that made lesser men step aside without thinking twice about it. People across 3 kingdoms called him the Alpha King, not because of any formal title, but because that was simply what he was, the strongest man to sit any northern throne in living memory, the last of a bloodline that had ruled Draymore through nothing but sheer, unbreakable will. The riders from the ridge crashed down onto the road, and the clash of steel against steel filled the narrow valley within seconds. Nathaniel drove his horse straight into the center of the chaos, rather than away from it, because that was how he had survived every ambush in 12 years of war, by refusing to let fear decide where he stood. A rider swung an axe toward his head, and Nathaniel caught the blow on his own blade, twisted his wrist, and sent the man tumbling backward off his horse, before the attacker even realized his weapon had been taken from his hands. Another came from the left, and Nathaniel's sword found him almost lazily, the fight so uneven it barely qualified as combat at all. Within minutes, it was over. 3 attackers lay wounded on the frozen road. The others had already turned and fled back up the ridge, vanishing into the tree line as quickly as they had appeared. Nathaniel sat still on his horse, breathing hard, watching the empty ridge with narrowed eyes. "Border raiders," said Colonel Gareth Finch, riding up beside him, blood on his sleeve from a shallow cut along his forearm. "3rd attack this month alone." "They are not raiders," Nathaniel said quietly. "Raiders steal. These men wanted me dead, nothing more." Gareth said nothing, because they both already knew the answer, the same answer that had haunted every border skirmish for the past 3 years. The kingdom of Rosefield, Draymore's neighbor to the south, had never fully accepted the peace their fathers signed a generation ago. Old grudges over stolen farmland and burned villages still smoldered beneath the surface of an uneasy truce, and lately, that smoldering resentment had begun turning into open violence again. "How many good men have we lost along this border this year?" Nathaniel asked, though he already knew the number by heart. 11, Gareth said quietly, "not counting today." Nathaniel turned his horse back toward the road home, jaw tight, the weight of every single one of those 11 names settling over him the way it always did after a fight like this one. He had inherited a kingdom built on conflict from a father who ruled through fear and vengeance, and for 12 years, Nathaniel had tried everything he knew to end that conflict without losing what remained of his people's trust in the process. Nothing had worked yet. Every attempt at peace collapsed within months, buried beneath fresh blood and fresh grief on both sides of the border. That evening, back within the stone walls of Draymore Castle, Nathaniel had barely removed his armor before Gareth appeared at his chamber door, a sealed letter in his hand, and an expression that mixed disbelief with cautious hope. "This arrived an hour ago," Gareth said, "by messenger from Rosefield, sealed with the personal signature of Lord Edward Bennet, head of their ruling council." Nathaniel took the letter and broke the wax seal without ceremony. He read it once in silence, then read it again, slower, as though the words might change meaning the second time. "They are offering a marriage," Nathaniel said finally, his voice flat with disbelief. "Their council wants to end the conflict permanently through an arranged marriage. A daughter of the Bennet household, given to me, in exchange for a full and lasting peace across the entire border. After 3 years of ambushes and burned fields, they choose marriage," Gareth said. "Forgive me, my lord, but that seems a rather sudden change of heart." "It seems desperate," Nathaniel said, setting the letter down and walking toward the window overlooking his own courtyard, where soldiers still moved among torches, tending to the wounded from that morning's attack, which tells me their council understands something we may not yet fully understand ourselves. Perhaps this endless war has cost them even more than it has cost us. Will you agree to it? Gareth asked. Nathaniel was silent for a long moment, watching the torchlight flicker against the stone walls of a kingdom he had spent his entire adult life trying to protect. He thought of the 11 names lost this year alone, of the villages along the border that no longer bothered rebuilding because they expected to be burned again within a season, of a war that had outlived any memory of what originally started it. I do not know this woman, Nathaniel said. I do not care what she looks like, or what songs she can sing, or what manners her household has taught her. I care only whether this marriage ends the bloodshed permanently, or whether it becomes one more broken promise added to a very long list. Then you will agree, Gareth said, understanding immediately. I will agree, Nathaniel said, on one condition. The terms must be signed by their entire council, not merely Lord Bennett alone, and any further attack across this border, before or after the wedding, will be treated as an act of open war, regardless of who claims responsibility. 3 days later, the terms returned, signed exactly as Nathaniel demanded. The wedding would take place within 2 weeks, at a small stone chapel standing on neutral ground between the two kingdoms, chosen specifically because it belonged fully to neither side. Nathaniel found the entire arrangement strange beyond words, agreeing to marry a stranger inside a building nobody had bothered fighting over, all so two exhausted kingdoms might finally stop killing each other over grievances neither side fully remembered starting. He told himself repeatedly that it did not matter who stood beneath that veil. A wife was simply another duty, another weight to carry the way he carried everything else, without complaint, because that was what being king had always demanded of him. Meanwhile, far to the south, within the Bennett household of Rosefield, an entirely different kind of storm was already gathering. Charlotte Hart pressed her ear against the heavy wooden door, listening to muffled, desperate crying from within, her stomach twisting tighter with every passing second. Inside that chamber, Amelia Bennett, the daughter chosen to marry the Alpha King of Draymore, had refused food for 2 days straight, refused every visitor except Charlotte herself, and refused, above everything else, to accept a marriage the entire kingdom whispered about in tones of pure dread. They say he is nearly 7 feet tall, Amelia had whispered the night before, her voice shaking so badly Charlotte could barely understand her. They say he crushed a man's skull with his bare hands during a training match. They say his own soldiers fear him more than they fear death itself. Charlotte had grown up hearing the same terrifying stories, every household across Rosefield repeating them like gospel truth, blaming the Alpha King for every burned field and lost husband the long conflict had ever produced. But Charlotte had also learned, over 19 years of watching how fear traveled faster than fact, that stories grown from dread rarely told the whole truth of any man. Charlotte was not born into nobility herself. Her mother had served the Bennett household as a healer until her death 6 years earlier. And since then, Charlotte had been raised alongside Amelia, almost like a sister, though never quite an equal one. She wore simpler dresses. She at a lower table during formal dinners. She addressed Amelia as my lady whenever guests were present, even though behind closed doors, the two of them had shared secrets, laughter, and quiet grief together since they were both small children. That closeness was exactly why Charlotte understood, better than anyone else in the entire household, just how genuinely terrified Amelia had become. You do not have to marry him, Charlotte said gently, slipping into the darkened chamber once the worst of the crying finally quieted. She sat on the edge of the bed and took Amelia's cold, trembling hands in her own. There has to be another way through this. There is no other way, Amelia said, her eyes red and swollen from days of weeping. My father has already signed the agreement before the entire council. If I refuse now, he says Rosefield loses everything this treaty was meant to secure, and the war begins again, worse than before, and everyone will say it happened because of me. Charlotte felt a familiar anger rising in her chest, quiet but sharp, the same anger she always felt whenever she watched the nobility of Rosefield treat their own children like pieces moved carelessly across a game board built entirely from other people's ambition. She had watched Amelia grow from a curious, laughing girl into a young woman constantly told what to want and who to become, always in service of her father's political survival. What if someone else went in your place? Charlotte said quietly, almost surprised to hear herself say it aloud. Amelia looked up sharply, disbelief flooding her tear-streaked face. "What are you saying, Charlotte?" "I am saying," Charlotte continued carefully, "the wedding happens on neutral ground, at a chapel neither kingdom controls. This king has never once laid eyes on your face. If someone close enough in height and build wore the veil in your place, would he even know the difference until it was far too late to undo the ceremony?" For a long moment, Amelia simply stared at her, and Charlotte worried immediately that she had said something dangerously foolish. Then, slowly, Amelia's expression shifted from pure shock into something that looked almost like desperate, fragile hope. "You cannot possibly mean what I think you mean," Amelia whispered. "I am not suggesting it lightly," Charlotte said. "I understand exactly what this would mean if it were ever discovered. But you gave me a home when I had lost everyone. Amelia, you have cared for me since we were children. If there is any way I can protect you from a marriage that terrifies you this deeply, I want to try, whatever the risk to myself." Amelia shook her head, though fresh tears were already gathering, softer ones this time. "He is enormous, a warrior feared across 3 kingdoms. They say he once broke a man's arm, simply for questioning one of his orders." "Stories grow taller with every telling," Charlotte said, though privately, even she felt a small shiver of genuine fear at the thought of standing before a man that fearsome. And besides, the council wants peace, signed on paper. They do not truly care which woman stands beneath that veil, only that a woman stands there at all when the treaty is finally sealed. "And after the wedding," Amelia asked, her voice barely above a whisper, "what happens then? You cannot hide your face from him forever. He becomes your husband the moment the vows are spoken." Charlotte had not allowed herself to think that far ahead, and the question settled heavy and cold in her chest. But she had already made her decision somewhere between the sound of Amelia's first sob and this quiet, frightened conversation now unfolding between them in the dark. "Then I will face whatever comes after," Charlotte said, with far more confidence in her voice than she actually felt. "Better it happens to me than to you, Amelia. You have a whole life ahead of you that you genuinely want to live. I do not yet know what mine looks like. Perhaps this is simply where mine is meant to lead me." They spent the rest of that night whispering plans back and forth, terrified and determined in equal measure. Only Nora, Amelia's most trusted lady's maid, an older woman who had served the Bennet family for decades and loved Amelia like her own daughter, would be told the full truth. Everyone else, including Lord Bennet himself, would be told simply that his daughter felt too overwhelmed to speak during the long journey north, and that the heavy northern lace veil, sent ahead as a traditional gift from House Hawke, must remain in place until the vows were completely spoken, as apparently required by Draymore custom. It was a fragile plan, built entirely on secrecy and desperation, and Charlotte understood clearly that it could collapse at any single moment along the way. Yet as she lay awake that night in her small room beside the castle kitchens, staring up at the ceiling, she found herself thinking less about the very real danger ahead, and more about the strange, quiet thrill of stepping, even briefly, into a life that had never been meant for her. She did not yet know that 9 years earlier, on a smoke-filled road far from any chapel, she had already met the Alpha King of Draymore once before, without either of them ever learning who the other truly was. The morning of the journey arrived cold and gray, thick mist hanging low across the hills separating the 2 kingdoms. Charlotte stood before a tall mirror in Amelia's private chamber, watching Nora fasten layer after layer of a wedding gown never intended to belong to her. The fabric felt heavier than anything Charlotte had ever worn before, pale silver thread, woven carefully through deep blue silk, and when Nora finally lowered the veil over her face, it felt like stepping behind a curtain into an entirely different world. "You look every inch a noblewoman," Nora said softly, adjusting the fine lace with careful, practiced hands. "Nobody will notice the difference, child. Not from any distance, and beneath this veil, not even standing close." "What if he demands I speak?" Charlotte asked, her voice muffled through the heavy fabric. "What if he asks questions only Amelia herself would know how to answer?" "Then you answer as calmly as your nerves will allow," Nora said. "And if you truly cannot, you say you feel overwhelmed, which will be nothing but the honest truth, veil or no veil covering your face." Amelia stood nearby, dressed instead in the plain traveling clothes of a lady's companion, her face pale, but her eyes steadier than Charlotte had seen them look in weeks. "I owe you everything for this," Amelia whispered, gripping Charlotte's gloved hand tightly between both of her own. "If anything goes wrong, I will not let you carry this blame alone. I promise you that, whatever happens." Charlotte squeezed her hand in return, though beneath the veil, her own heart pounded harder than she wanted to admit even to herself. "Let us simply hope it does not come to that, my lady." The carriage ride toward the neutral chapel took the better part of a full day, winding slowly through hills, still scarred from old battles, past burned fields, only just beginning to grow green again, past small villages, where children paused their games to silently watch the procession roll past. Charlotte sat rigid beneath the veil the entire journey, listening to Lord Bennet speak proudly to the accompanying guards about the historic importance of this alliance, about how his family's sacrifice would surely be remembered for generations. Charlotte wanted desperately to scream that it was not truly his sacrifice at all, but she said nothing, because silence was the exact role she had willingly chosen. Silence wrapped carefully in silk and lace, carrying a secret heavy enough to reshape two kingdoms entirely, should it ever be discovered by the wrong pair of eyes. As the carriage finally crested the last hill, and the old stone chapel came into distant view, standing alone against a darkening sky, Charlotte felt the mist thickening steadily around them, curling low across the frozen ground, like something almost alive. Somewhere beyond that mist, on the northern side of this fragile meeting point, another procession was already drawing closer, carrying a king who believed with complete certainty that he was about to marry a stranger he would never truly come to know. Back at Draymore Castle, on the morning before his own procession departed, Nathaniel had summoned his full council one final time, wanting every advisor to understand exactly what this marriage would and would not change. "This treaty ends the fighting along our border," Nathaniel told the assembled lords, standing at the head of the long stone table where his father had once ruled through threats instead of reason. "It does not erase 12 years of grief. It does not bring back the men we have lost. But it stops the bleeding from continuing, and that alone makes it worth whatever discomfort a stranger's presence within these walls might bring." Lord Harold Vane, the oldest and most cautious member of the council, folded his weathered hands together and studied his king carefully. "And if this bride proves unwilling, my lord, if she resents this arrangement as deeply as Rosefield's people have resented us for a generation, then I will treat her with patience and fairness regardless," Nathaniel said. "I did not agree to this marriage expecting affection. I agreed to it expecting peace." "Anything beyond that is simply more than I asked for." Gareth, standing near the window, glanced toward his king with an expression Nathaniel chose not to examine too closely. There was something almost sad in it, as though Gareth already suspected his king had convinced himself to expect far less from life than he actually deserved. The council murmured its reluctant approval, and within the hour, Nathaniel's own procession began the long ride south toward the chapel, carrying with it a king who told himself, again and again along the frozen road, that this marriage was simply one more duty among many, nothing more than another weight to be carried without complaint. He did not yet know that the woman traveling toward that same chapel from the opposite direction had once knelt beside him on a different road entirely, 9 years earlier, when he was young and wounded and utterly certain he would not survive the night. Neither of them yet understood how completely and how quickly that certainty was about to be shattered. The chapel bells rang once, a single low tone rolling across the misty valley, and Nathaniel felt the sound settle into his chest, like a stone dropping through still water. He stood at the front of the small stone chapel, dressed in ceremonial black trimmed with silver, feeling the weight of the moment far more than he had expected to. He had faced armies without flinching. He had stood on battlefields where men twice his numbers had tried to end his life before sunrise. Yet standing here now, waiting to marry a woman he had never once met, he found his hands unwilling to stay completely still. Gareth stood beside him as his witness, along with only 4 guards from each kingdom, exactly as the treaty demanded. On the opposite side of the narrow aisle stood the delegation from Rosefield, led by Lord Bennet himself, a thin, visibly nervous man who kept glancing toward the chapel doors, as though expecting something to go terribly wrong at any moment. "Nervous," Gareth murmured, quiet enough that only Nathaniel could hear him. "I do not get nervous," Nathaniel said, though his jaw felt tighter than usual. "Of course not," Gareth said, the faintest trace of amusement coloring his voice. The chapel doors creaked open, and a hush fell instantly over the small gathering. Nathaniel turned, as tradition demanded, and watched his bride begin her slow, careful walk down the narrow aisle, her face completely hidden beneath a heavy veil of pale lace, her gloved hands folded around a small bundle of white winter flowers. She moved with deliberate care, and Nathaniel noticed the slight unevenness in her steps, as though the shoes she wore did not quite fit properly, or as though she was simply unused to walking in such elaborate, heavy fabric. He told himself it did not matter. She was nervous, that was all. Any woman would feel nervous, marrying a stranger from a kingdom that had spent years locked in conflict with her own. As she reached the front of the chapel and stood beside him, Nathaniel caught the faint scent of lavender rising from beneath the layers of lace, and something about it tugged gently at a memory he could not quite place, distant and unclear, like a dream slipping quietly away upon waking. The priest, an elderly man from a village belonging to neither kingdom, began the ceremony with careful, measured words about peace, about unity, about two exhausted lands finally choosing understanding over endless, senseless conflict. Nathaniel listened with only half his attention, the other half fixed entirely on the woman standing silently beside him, wondering what kind of person waited behind that impenetrable veil. When the priest asked for the vows, Nathaniel spoke his clearly, his deep voice steady, despite the strange tightness building in his chest. He promised to protect his bride, to honor the fragile peace this union represented, to rule beside her with fairness and unwavering strength. Then it was her turn to speak. For a long moment, she said nothing, and Nathaniel felt the tension inside the chapel sharpen considerably. Lord Bennet shifted uncomfortably where he stood. Finally, in a voice that trembled only slightly, softer and more careful than Nathaniel expected, she spoke her own vows, promising the same things he had already promised, though her words came slower, as though she was choosing each one with tremendous care. Nathaniel noticed something in that voice, a certain quiet warmth beneath the obvious nervousness, that did not match the cold, calculating impression he had privately built of a noblewoman raised within Rosefield's political court. He pushed the thought aside quickly. It did not matter how she sounded. Only the treaty itself truly mattered here. "By the laws of both kingdoms," the priest said, "and before all witnesses gathered here today, I now ask that the veil be lifted, so that this union may be sealed properly in the sight of all present." The chapel fell into complete silence. Nathaniel turned to face his bride fully, and reached up with careful, steady hands toward the edge of the delicate lace veil. Beneath the fabric, he saw her take a slow, uneven breath, her shoulders rising and falling with what he assumed was nothing more than ordinary wedding day nerves. He lifted the veil. For a moment, nothing happened at all. Nathaniel simply stared, his pale eyes locked on the face now fully revealed before him, and something inside his chest went completely still, the way the entire world seems to go still in the second before lightning finally strikes. He knew her face. Not from any court records, not from a painted portrait sent ahead of the wedding, but from memory, real memory, 9 years old and buried deep, of a girl with the same wide, gentle eyes and the same small scar above her left eyebrow, kneeling beside him on a smoke-filled road, pressing a torn strip of cloth firmly against a wound in his side, while soldiers shouted somewhere in the chaos and darkness around them. "You," Nathaniel said, so quietly that only she could possibly hear it. Her eyes widened, the same shock flooding across her expression, and for a single suspended heartbeat, neither of them moved, caught helplessly between two worlds colliding at once, the past and the present, crashing together, directly in front of an entire chapel, full of witnesses who had no idea what they were actually watching unfold before them. Lord Bennet, standing rigid among the Rosefield delegation, went pale as fresh snow. His eyes darted frantically toward the veiled woman's now uncovered face, and something in his expression shifted rapidly from confusion into open, unmistakable panic. "That is not," he started to say, before catching himself abruptly, his voice dying somewhere in his throat. Nathaniel heard it regardless. He heard the exact words Lord Bennet had swallowed back before finishing them, and his gaze snapped toward the trembling nobleman, even as his hand remained gently resting near the veil he had only just lifted. "Not who," Nathaniel said, his voice low and dangerous now, carrying easily across the completely silent chapel. "Finish that sentence, Lord Bennett." Beside him, the young woman he had just legally married stood frozen in place, her eyes locked on his face. Fear and something else entirely, something almost like desperate recognition, flickering there in equal, uncertain measure. Gareth took a half-step forward, his hand instinctively moving toward the hilt of his sword, sensing immediately the sudden shift rippling through the air around them all. "My Lord King," Lord Bennett stammered, his voice cracking badly. "There has been, I deeply fear, some manner of terrible misunderstanding." "Explain yourself," Nathaniel said, and the single simple word somehow carried more weight than any shout ever could have managed. The young woman beside him took one shaking breath, and before Lord Bennett could stumble through any further excuses, she spoke first, her voice steadier now than it had sounded during the vows, though her hands still trembled visibly at her sides. "My name is Charlotte Hart," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent stone chapel. "I am not the daughter chosen for this marriage. I took her place willingly." A wave of urgent murmurs rippled through both delegations at once, soldiers exchanging alarmed glances, Gareth's hand tightening fully around his sword hilt, Lord Bennett looking as though he might genuinely faint on the spot before them. Nathaniel, however, did not move at all. He simply looked at her, truly looked at her, this woman who had just openly admitted to deceiving an entire kingdom on the very day of her own wedding, and felt something complicated and entirely unfamiliar settle deep behind his ribs. "You lied," he said quietly, "in front of two kingdoms, on the exact day meant to finally end our war." "Yes," Charlotte said, meeting his eyes directly without ever looking away, though her voice still shook slightly with fear. "I did, and I would make the same choice again." The chapel bells, somewhere high above them, chose that exact moment to ring out once more, marking the formal completion of a ceremony that had just become far more complicated than anyone standing inside those old stone walls had ever possibly expected it to become. Chaos erupted through the chapel the instant those words left Charlotte's mouth. Lord Bennett dropped to his knees on the cold stone floor, babbling apologies that made little clear sense, something about protecting his true daughter, something about desperation and fear, and having no other choice available to him. The guards from Rosefield shifted uneasily, unsure whether they were meant to defend their lord or step quickly away from him instead. Gareth's soldiers tensed visibly, hands hovering near their weapons, waiting for a single word from their king before taking any further action. Nathaniel raised one hand, and the entire chapel fell silent again almost instantly, obedience so complete and immediate that Charlotte felt a fresh wave of fear roll straight through her. This was the man the stories had always warned her about, the one whose presence alone could command an entire room without ever needing to raise his voice. "Everyone present will remain calm," Nathaniel said, his voice carrying easily to every corner of the small stone chapel. "No blood will be spilled inside these walls today. That is not how any of this will end." He turned back toward Charlotte, and for a long, silent moment, he studied her face carefully, as though trying to reconcile the frightened young woman standing before him now, with the memory buried somewhere deep in his mind for 9 long, difficult years. "Do you remember me?" Nathaniel asked quietly, so quietly that only Charlotte and Gareth standing nearby could actually hear the question. Charlotte's breath caught sharply in her throat. She had spent the entire journey toward this chapel, focused entirely on surviving the ceremony without being discovered, never once imagining that the stranger she was marrying might already be a face carved somewhere deep within her own childhood memory. "The road near Millbrook Crossing," she said slowly, the memory surfacing piece by careful piece, as she spoke it aloud for the first time in years. 9 years ago, there was an ambush along the border. A young soldier was badly wounded, left behind when his unit retreated too quickly to notice him missing. I found him hiding in the trees, bleeding heavily from a deep cut along his side. "You gave me your scarf," Nathaniel said, quietly finishing the memory for her, "torn into rough strips, to slow the bleeding until help could arrive. You never once asked my name. You never asked which kingdom I fought for. You simply helped me, and then you disappeared into the trees, before I could even properly thank you for saving my life." "I was only 12 years old," Charlotte whispered. "I did not understand kingdoms or wars back then. I only understood that someone was badly hurt and needed help immediately." Nathaniel's expression, usually carved from unmoving stone, softened by the smallest possible degree, an almost imperceptible shift that only someone standing this close would ever have noticed at all. "That wounded soldier was me," he said. "I have carried that memory for 9 full years, wondering constantly what became of the girl who saved my life and then vanished into the trees before I ever learned her name." The chapel remained utterly silent, every single witness present straining desperately to understand the strange, quiet exchange happening between the king and the woman who had just deceived an entire kingdom to stand beside him at his own wedding. Lord Bennet, still kneeling helplessly on the stone floor, finally found his voice again, though it wavered badly with fear. "My Lord King, please understand, my true daughter Amelia was overcome with genuine terror at the thought of this marriage. Charlotte offered to take her place entirely, to prevent the treaty from collapsing completely. She acted only out of loyalty, never out of any deceit meant to harm you personally." "Loyalty and deceit are not always entirely different things," Nathaniel said, though his tone had lost much of its earlier sharpness. "But I have fought enough wars to recognize the clear difference between someone acting purely out of malice and someone acting out of genuine desperation to protect a person they truly love." He turned back toward Charlotte. "Is this account true? Did you take this place willingly, purely to protect Lady Amelia from this marriage?" "Yes," Charlotte said firmly. "She has cared for me since I was a child, with no remaining family of my own. When I saw how genuinely terrified she was of this marriage, I could not simply stand by and watch, doing nothing to help her. I chose to come in her place, fully knowing the risk I was taking. And now that risk has become full reality," Nathaniel said. "The vows have already been spoken aloud. The union has already been sealed beneath the sight of witnesses from both kingdoms present here today. Under the laws of my land, and I strongly suspect under the laws of yours as well, that marriage cannot simply be undone now, merely because the wrong bride happened to stand beneath the veil." Charlotte felt the blood drain slowly from her face. She had planned only far enough to survive the ceremony itself, never truly allowing herself to imagine what might happen if the deception was discovered before the vows could be quietly annulled and forgotten entirely. "You mean," she said slowly, "we remain legally married regardless?" "Under the law," Nathaniel said. "Yes. Unless both kingdoms formally agree to dissolve this union entirely, which would almost certainly reignite the very conflict this marriage was specifically designed to end. Lord Bennet understands this fact as well as I do myself." Lord Bennet nodded frantically from where he still knelt, clearly grasping the unexpected lifeline now being offered to him. "The original treaty specifies only that a daughter of House Bennet must marry the King of Draymore. It does not specify which daughter by exact name. Charlotte, though born to a household servant, was formally raised within our household from a young age. Under our own laws, she carries sufficient standing to fulfill the treaty's exact terms, provided the king himself accepts her as his lawful and rightful wife." Nathaniel looked at Charlotte for a long, considering moment, weighing something behind his pale eyes that she could not quite fully read or understand. The entire future of 2 exhausted kingdoms seemed to balance precariously on whatever single decision he made within the next few seconds, and Charlotte found herself holding her breath, genuinely uncertain whether she hoped he would accept her completely or send her away in complete disgrace, back toward a home that had never truly been her own to begin with. "I made a solemn vow inside this chapel," Nathaniel said finally, his voice steady and clear enough for absolutely everyone present to hear him. "I promised to protect my bride, and to honor the fragile peace this union represents for both our peoples. I do not break vows, regardless of whatever unusual circumstances happen to surround them." He extended his hand toward Charlotte, an offer rather than any kind of command, and Charlotte looked down at it, at the same strong hand that had once pressed desperately against a wound on his side 9 years earlier, while she worked frantically to stop the bleeding, before it could take his life entirely. "You do not need to fear me," Nathaniel added, quieter now, meant only for her ears alone. "Whatever frightening stories you have heard about me throughout Rosefield, I promise you, they are greatly exaggerated by men who desperately needed a monster to justify their own actions during this endless war." Slowly, carefully, Charlotte placed her hand in his, and felt his fingers close gently around hers, warm and remarkably steady, despite the storm of tension still hanging thick over the entire chapel. Then I accept, Charlotte said. Whatever comes next for both of us. The priest, who had remained completely silent through this entire extraordinary exchange, cleared his throat nervously and glanced anxiously between the two delegations. The union stands, he announced, sealed properly before witnesses, and now formally confirmed once again by the king himself. As the small gathering slowly began to disperse into uneasy, whispered conversations, Gareth stepped close to Nathaniel's side, his expression clearly troubled despite this seemingly peaceful resolution. "This will not sit well at all with your council," he murmured quietly. "A servant girl, deceiving an entire kingdom on her own wedding day, now suddenly sitting beside you as queen." "My council will accept whatever decision protects this peace," Nathaniel said, his eyes still fixed steadily on Charlotte as she spoke quietly, with a still visibly frightened Lord Bennet nearby. "And besides, Gareth, this is far more than simply a servant girl. This is the very same girl who saved my life, on a road I never truly expected to survive at all." Gareth studied his king carefully, noting something in Nathaniel's expression he had rarely witnessed before. Not since the death of Nathaniel's own mother years earlier had softened something permanently within him. "You already care for her," Gareth said, not entirely a question. Nathaniel did not answer immediately. Instead, he watched as Charlotte turned back toward him. Uncertainty and quiet courage mixed together in equal measure across her expression, and felt the strange, unfamiliar warmth building steadily in his chest settle into something far steadier, something that felt, against every single expectation he had carried into this chapel that morning, remarkably close to genuine hope. "I do not yet know exactly what I feel," Nathaniel admitted quietly, "but I fully intend to find out, whatever it takes." Outside the ancient chapel walls, the thick morning mist had finally begun to lift slowly, revealing a pale afternoon sun breaking gradually through heavy clouds, though neither kingdom's delegation felt entirely at ease as they prepared for the long journey back toward their respective lands, each side quietly carrying the exact same unspoken question. What would ultimately come of a marriage built entirely on secrets, distant memory, and a single fragile promise made beneath a veil that should never have hidden the full truth for nearly as long as it actually did? The gates of Draymore Castle had never once opened for a bride before, and the soldiers standing watch along the stone walls did not bother hiding their open curiosity as Charlotte's carriage rolled through them for the very first time in the castle's long history. She sat rigid inside the carriage, the ceremonial veil now folded quietly in her lap instead of covering her face, watching through the small window as the northern kingdom slowly unfolded before her eyes for the first time. Everything looked harder here, sharper somehow, built from cold gray stone instead of the pale sandstone common throughout Rosefield, and yet Charlotte noticed something she had not fully expected among the fortress walls and heavily armed patrols moving steadily along them. Children played happily in the courtyards below. Merchants called out prices loudly at a busy market square nearby. Life continued here, ordinary and remarkably stubborn, despite years of relentless war, pressing constantly in from every border. "It is not at all what the stories described," she murmured quietly, mostly to herself. Beside her, Nathaniel, who had chosen to ride inside the carriage rather than on horseback for this final stretch of their journey, glanced toward the window with faint but genuine curiosity. "What exactly did the stories describe to you?" "Ruins," Charlotte admitted honestly. "Suffering everywhere. A kingdom held together only through constant fear of its own king. And what do you actually see here instead, now that you have arrived?" Charlotte studied the busy courtyard a moment longer before finally answering him honestly. "People. Simply trying to live their ordinary lives, exactly the same as anyone back home in Rosefield." Nathaniel said nothing in response, but Charlotte caught the faint shift in his jaw, something that might have been quiet satisfaction, though he offered no further comment, as the carriage finally rolled to a complete stop before the castle's massive main entrance. The following days passed in a steady blur of unfamiliar routines and careful, watchful eyes following her everywhere. Charlotte was given chambers far grander than anything she had ever known back in Rosefield, soft silk sheets and beautifully carved furniture, and a personal attendant named Grace, a cheerful young woman near Charlotte's own age, who seemed genuinely curious rather than resentful of the strange new queen who had arrived under such scandalous and unusual circumstances. "Everyone throughout the castle is talking about you constantly," Grace admitted one quiet morning, helping Charlotte into a simple gray gown, better suited for the much colder northern climate. Some say you tricked the king into marrying you against his will. Others say the king somehow recognized you from an old story, a debt of honor he felt bound to repay properly. Neither version is entirely true, Charlotte said carefully, and neither version is entirely false either. Grace smiled faintly, clearly intrigued but wise enough not to push the matter any further. Well, whatever the actual truth turns out to be, the king has not smiled this often in the 2 full years I have served within this castle. Make of that whatever you will, my lady. Charlotte did not quite know what to make of it herself. In the days since their wedding, Nathaniel had visited her chambers each and every evening, not to make any demands of her whatsoever, but simply to talk, cautious and careful conversations that slowly revealed small pieces of the man hiding behind his frightening public reputation. He told her about his father's harsh, brutal reign, about the crushing weight of inheriting a war he had never personally chosen to fight in the first place. She told him about growing up as a quiet outsider within the Bennett household, about the persistent loneliness of being cared for, but never truly belonging anywhere fully. Neither of them spoke directly about the growing warmth steadily building between them, though it was there regardless, unmistakable, present in the way Nathaniel's expression softened whenever she entered any room, present in the way Charlotte found herself looking forward to his evening visits, more than she wanted to fully admit, even to herself. Not everyone within the castle shared Grace's easy curiosity, however. Nathaniel's council, a group of stern, battle-hardened advisors who had guided the kingdom through years of relentless conflict, viewed Charlotte's sudden presence with open, unmistakable suspicion. She deceived an entire kingdom, argued Lord Harold Vane. During a tense private meeting Charlotte was not invited to attend, but happened to overhear from the corridor just outside. How exactly can we trust a queen who built her entire position on a deliberate lie? She protected someone she deeply loved from a marriage that genuinely terrified her, Nathaniel replied, his voice carrying clearly through the heavy wooden door. That is not the same thing as malice, Harold, and you know that perfectly well. Perception matters just as much as truth in matters concerning the crown, Harold pressed further. Rosefield's nobility already whispers openly that we accepted a mere servant girl as queen, simply because our king proved too soft-hearted to send her home in proper disgrace. Then let them whisper whatever they wish, Nathaniel said, his tone final and unmoving. I did not marry her to satisfy the opinions of nobles who have never once bled for this kingdom, the way I personally have. I married her because a solemn vow was spoken aloud, and because I fully intend to honor that vow completely. Charlotte stepped quietly away from the door, before anyone inside could discover her listening, her heart pounding with a strange, complicated mixture of gratitude and genuine fear. Nathaniel was defending her, publicly and without any hesitation whatsoever, but she understood now more clearly than ever before the real danger her presence created within his own court. Danger extending far beyond simple gossip and disapproving glances alone. That evening, when Nathaniel visited her chambers as he had faithfully, each night since their arrival, Charlotte decided to speak plainly, rather than continue avoiding the difficult truth hanging heavily between them. Your counsel does not trust me, she said, before he could even settle fully into the chair across from her usual seat beside the fire, and they are not entirely wrong to feel that particular way about things. Nathaniel studied her for a long moment before responding carefully. You are referring to this afternoon's meeting. I overheard a portion of it, Charlotte admitted honestly. I am not upset that you now know this. I only want you to fully understand that I did not come here seeking a crown, or any title, or any particular position within your court whatsoever. I came here purely to protect someone I love from a fear she could not possibly face entirely alone. I never once expected any of this to become permanent. And now that it clearly has, Nathaniel said quietly, what do you actually want, Charlotte? Not what duty demands of you, and not what the treaty strictly requires. What do you genuinely want for yourself? The question caught her completely off guard. Gentler, and far more personal than she had expected from a man the entire world had painted as cold and unfeeling. She considered it very carefully before answering, because for the first time since the veil had dropped inside that quiet stone chapel, someone was genuinely asking what she herself wanted, rather than simply what circumstances had forcefully demanded of her. I want a matter here, Charlotte said slowly. Not because of any treaty, and not because of some old debt from a road I barely even remember walking down. I want to build something entirely real, if that is even possible between two people who began this marriage, as complete strangers to one another. Nathaniel rose slowly from his chair and crossed the room, kneeling beside where she sat, so that their eyes met fully at the same level for the very first time since their wedding day. It is entirely possible, he said. I have watched enough political marriages within neighboring courts to know that most of them remain cold and distant forever, without exception. But I do not believe ours has to follow that same tired path, Charlotte. Not after everything that has brought the two of us here together. Even with your entire council standing firmly against me, Charlotte said. Especially then, Nathaniel said, a faint smile touching the corner of his mouth, rare and completely unguarded. I have spent my entire reign proving myself against men who doubted me constantly. I see no reason at all to stop now, simply because the person they happen to doubt is my own wife, instead of myself. For the first time since arriving within Draymore Castle, Charlotte allowed herself to genuinely hope that this strange, entirely unexpected marriage might eventually become something truly worth building together, rather than remaining simply a burden she had accepted, purely out of desperation and loyalty towards someone else entirely. Outside her chamber window, the deep northern night settled quietly over the castle, unaware that far beyond its walls, in a shadowed corner of Rosefield's own royal court, a very different and far more dangerous conversation was already beginning to unfold, one that would soon threaten to tear apart the fragile peace this marriage had only just begun to carefully build between them. Lord Julian Crane had waited 11 long years for a chance exactly like this one, and he did not intend to let it slip quietly away, simply because a servant girl had somehow managed to charm her way into a foreign king's good graces. He sat in a private chamber deep within Rosefield's royal palace, surrounded by 3 other nobles who shared his particular brand of bitter ambition, men who had lost land, influence, and family fortune during the long years of conflict against Draymore, and who viewed the recent peace treaty not as any kind of triumph, but as a humiliating surrender dressed up carefully in wedding silk. The treaty was already fragile enough on its own, Julian said, tapping one finger sharply against the wooden table between them. Built entirely on a marriage nobody truly wanted in the first place, forced through by a desperate old man, far too frightened to lose his own head over a broken agreement. Now we learn the bride herself was nothing more than a substitute, a mere servant girl playing dress-up in another woman's gown. The King of Draymore accepted her regardless of that fact, pointed out one of the other nobles, a thin man named Simon Locke who had grown quite wealthy, trading along the border before the fighting destroyed half his caravans entirely. That certainly complicates matters considerably. If he intended to reject her outright, surely he would have already done so by now. He accepted her because rejecting her outright would have collapsed the entire treaty instantly, and everyone standing inside that chapel understood this perfectly well, Julian said. But acceptance made under pressure is not the same thing as genuine loyalty. If the truth of her deception spreads far enough, loudly enough, even a king as famously stubborn as Nathaniel Hawke may find himself entirely unable to protect her without losing the crucial support of his own council. And what exactly do you propose we do? Simon asked, though the hunger clearly evident in his voice suggested he already suspected the answer perfectly well. Julian allowed himself a slow, deeply satisfied smile. I propose we simply help the truth travel a little faster than it might naturally on its own. A few carefully placed rumors spread along the busy merchant routes. A letter or two, delivered quietly, to exactly the right nobles within Draymore's own court, men like Lord Harold Vane, who already distrusts this marriage deeply. If the scandal grows large enough, loud enough, the mounting pressure to annul the marriage may become entirely impossible for even the king himself to resist. And if the marriage itself collapses, Simon said slowly, understanding finally dawning fully across his face, the entire treaty collapses right along with it. Precisely, Julian said, and when the treaty finally collapses, Rosefield will desperately need new leadership willing to negotiate a settlement that does not require humiliating our entire nation by handing over our own daughters as simple peace offerings to a giant northern warlord. The men gathered around the table exchanged glances heavy with unspoken ambition, each of them already imagining a version of Rosefield's future, where their own personal influence had grown considerably, built carefully upon the ruins of a marriage that had briefly, foolishly, threatened to end their long and profitable conflict for good. "There remains one considerable difficulty," Simon said carefully. Lord Bennet himself confirmed the marriage's full legitimacy inside that chapel, before witnesses from both kingdoms present. "If we accuse the Queen of deception now, we risk exposing Lord Bennet's own direct complicity in this entire arrangement. Then Lord Bennet will simply need to become part of the story we tell," Julian said, his voice turning cold and calculating. A desperate father, manipulated entirely by a scheming servant girl who saw a golden opportunity to elevate her own position through pure deception. "It matters very little whether the specific details are entirely accurate, Simon. It only matters whether enough people ultimately choose to believe them." Far to the north, entirely unaware of the quiet conspiracy steadily taking shape within Rosefield's palace walls, Charlotte spent her mornings slowly learning the rhythms of her strange new life, walking the castle gardens together with Grace, sitting in on smaller council meetings Nathaniel had gradually begun inviting her to attend, and slowly earning small, hard-fought moments of genuine trust from soldiers and servants, who had initially viewed her with open suspicion. "You handled Lord Vane rather well this morning," Nathaniel remarked one afternoon, as they walked together along the castle's outer wall, the cold northern wind pulling loose strands of Charlotte's dark hair free from its careful braid. "He asked me a question, clearly meant to embarrass me, in front of the entire council," Charlotte said. "Something about grain distribution during the coming winter shortages. I suspect he fully expected me to have no answer for him at all. And yet you answered thoroughly enough that even Vane had no further argument left to offer," Nathaniel said, faint amusement clearly coloring his voice. "Where exactly did a healer's daughter learn so much about grain distribution and seasonal winter shortages? I spent years watching my mother treat the poorest families throughout Rosefield during the harshest winters of this entire war," Charlotte said. "Hunger and illness often arrive together, hand in hand. I learned quickly that understanding how food actually moved through a kingdom mattered just as much as understanding how to treat the sickness that inevitably followed when it did not move quickly enough." Nathaniel glanced at her with something close to genuine admiration. "My own father never once considered such matters worth his personal attention or time. He left it entirely to his stewards, and those stewards often let entire villages go hungry, rather than disrupt their own comfortable routines in any way." "Perhaps that is something I can genuinely help change here," Charlotte said. "If your council ever grows willing to trust my opinion on matters beyond simply proving that I belong here at all." "They will eventually learn to trust you completely," Nathaniel said, "the exact same way that I did, slowly, and then all at once entirely." Charlotte smiled warmly at that, a small, genuine smile that had grown considerably easier to offer with each passing day inside Draymore Castle. For the first time since the chaos of their wedding day, she allowed herself to imagine a future here that extended well beyond simple survival, a future where she might actually build something meaningful alongside a man she had once feared deeply, based purely on frightened rumors whispered constantly throughout her own homeland. That fragile, steadily growing peace, however, was not destined to last uninterrupted for very much longer at all. 3 days later, a messenger arrived urgently at the castle gates, bearing urgent correspondence from Rosefield, sealed with the personal signature of several prominent nobles Nathaniel did not immediately recognize. Gareth delivered the sealed letter directly to Nathaniel's private study, his expression visibly troubled as he watched his king break the wax seal and begin reading the contents carefully. Nathaniel's expression darkened steadily with each passing line, his jaw tightening noticeably, his pale eyes growing colder than Gareth had witnessed them look in many months. "What exactly is it?" Gareth asked carefully. "A formal complaint," Nathaniel said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger, "signed by 4 separate members of Rosefield's nobility, demanding an official investigation into what they are openly calling a fraudulent marriage, deliberately orchestrated, through calculated deception, against the crown of Draymore itself. They wish to annul the treaty entirely," Gareth said, understanding the implications immediately. "They wish to destroy Charlotte completely," Nathaniel said, setting the letter down with deliberate, controlled care, though his hands were not entirely steady as he did so. "And in doing so, destroy the only lasting peace this kingdom has managed to secure, in over an entire decade of fighting. Gareth studied his king carefully. You believe someone within Rosefield's court is deliberately manufacturing this entire scandal? I know it for certain, Nathaniel said. Lord Bennet confirmed the marriage's full legitimacy himself inside that chapel. This complaint conveniently ignores that fact entirely, choosing instead to frame Charlotte as a scheming servant who manipulated an entire kingdom purely for her own personal gain. That is not the language of genuine confusion, Gareth. That is the language of a carefully constructed, deliberate lie, designed to spread as far and as quickly as humanly possible. Someone within Rosefield's own court wants this treaty to fail completely, Gareth said slowly. And they have chosen Charlotte as the easiest possible target through which to accomplish that goal, Nathaniel said, rising from his chair, with barely contained fury building visibly within him. They believe a servant girl has no allies powerful enough to protect her properly, no voice loud enough to counter whatever story they ultimately choose to tell about her. What will you do about this? Gareth asked. Nathaniel's expression hardened instantly into something Gareth recognized immediately. The exact same unyielding resolve his king carried onto every single battlefield he had ever personally led. I will prove them entirely, completely wrong, Nathaniel said firmly. Whoever stands behind this scheme is about to discover that Charlotte Hart has far more powerful protection standing behind her than they ever possibly anticipated. By the time the rumors finally reached Charlotte's own ears, they had already twisted into something almost entirely unrecognizable from the original truth. She heard the first whispered version from Grace, who arrived at her chambers one morning with red-rimmed eyes and a nervous, deeply apologetic expression on her face. The servants throughout the castle are talking, my lady, Grace admitted reluctantly. Word has spread from Rosefield, claiming that you tricked Lord Bennet himself into believing you had noble blood, that you deceived the entire kingdom, including the king, purely to escape your position as a common servant. Charlotte felt her stomach drop sharply, though she forced her expression to remain outwardly steady and calm. That is not at all what actually happened. I know that already, Grace said quickly. Most of us here within the castle already know that much, but cruel rumors spread far faster than truth ever does, especially when powerful people specifically want them to spread that particular way. By that same afternoon, the rumors had grown even further out of control. Whispered claims now suggesting that Charlotte had somehow poisoned Amelia to prevent her from attending her own wedding entirely, that she had manipulated Lord Bennet through outright blackmail, that she had planned this entire deception for years, patiently waiting for the perfect opportunity to seize a crown that was never truly meant to belong to her at all. Charlotte sat alone in her chambers that evening, staring quietly at her own reflection in a small mirror, hardly recognizing the monstrous version of herself now being openly described throughout both entire kingdoms. She thought of her mother, gentle and hard-working, who had spent her entire life healing others without ever once asking for recognition or reward. She thought of Amelia, whom she had tried so desperately to protect, and wondered with growing dread whether her own actions had somehow placed her beloved friend in even greater danger, instead of protecting her at all. A soft knock interrupted her spiraling thoughts, and Nathaniel entered without waiting for any response, his expression grim but clearly determined. You have already heard the rumors, Charlotte said quietly, not bothering to hide her genuine distress any longer. I have heard every single one of them, Nathaniel confirmed, and I do not believe a single word of any of them. But others certainly do, Charlotte said. Your council already distrusted me, even before this scandal began spreading. Now they have exactly the excuse they have always needed to demand you send me away permanently. Let them demand whatever they wish to demand, Nathaniel said, his voice firm and unwavering. I intend to address this situation directly, rather than allowing these lies to spread further unchallenged while I remain completely silent. What exactly do you mean by that? Tomorrow morning, I will summon my entire full council, along with representatives from Rosefield's own delegation, Nathaniel said. You will tell your complete story plainly, exactly as it truly happened, without any shame and without any apology whatsoever. I will stand directly beside you as you speak, and I will make it absolutely clear to everyone present that any further attempt to spread these lies will be treated as a direct and serious insult against the crown itself. Charlotte studied his face carefully, searching for any trace of hesitation, any hidden doubt buried behind his steady resolve. She found absolutely none. "You are risking a great deal by standing so publicly beside me in this," she said. "If your counsel turns against you completely over this matter, the consequences could reach far beyond simply my own personal reputation. I have built this entire kingdom's trust through honesty and genuine strength, not through hiding away from difficult truths," Nathaniel said. "I do not intend to abandon that core principle now, simply because the difficult truth in question happens to involve my own wife directly." The following morning, the great hall of Draymore Castle filled with tension, so thick it seemed to press heavily against the very stone walls surrounding them. Lord Vane and the rest of Nathaniel's council sat along one side of the long chamber, while a small delegation from Rosefield, including a visibly nervous Lord Bennet, sat along the opposite side entirely. Charlotte stood at the very center of the hall, Nathaniel beside her, his hand resting lightly but firmly at the small of her back, a quiet, unmistakable show of genuine support, visible to absolutely everyone present in the room. "Cruel rumors have spread throughout both our kingdoms," Nathaniel began, his voice carrying clearly and steadily through the completely silent hall, claiming that my wife deliberately deceived Lord Bennet, deceived Lady Amelia, and deceived myself as well, purely for her own personal gain. "I have called this gathering today so that the complete truth may finally be spoken clearly, without any further distortion whatsoever." He nodded toward Charlotte, and she stepped forward slowly, her heart pounding heavily but her voice remarkably steady, drawing on a deep courage she had not fully realized she possessed until this exact moment. "I did not deceive anyone for my own personal gain," Charlotte said, addressing the entire hall directly and without hesitation. "Lady Amelia, the daughter originally chosen for this marriage, was absolutely terrified of a union she had been forced into, entirely without her own consent. I offered to take her place, not out of any personal ambition, but because she had shown me genuine kindness and family, when I had none of my own remaining. I fully understood the risk involved when I made that choice, and I have never once regretted protecting someone I truly love, regardless of whatever consequences I now face because of that choice." Lord Vane leaned forward slightly, his expression still visibly skeptical. "And what exactly of the claims suggesting Lord Bennet was manipulated, or blackmailed into supporting this entire deception?" Every eye in the hall turned toward Lord Bennet, who rose slowly from his seat, his hands trembling slightly, as he addressed the assembled hall directly. "There was no blackmail involved whatsoever," he said, his voice gradually gaining strength as he continued speaking. "I agreed to this substitution entirely myself, out of pure desperation to protect my daughter's well-being, while still fully honoring the treaty my kingdom desperately needed to survive." Charlotte Hart acted with far more courage and integrity that day than I personally displayed throughout years of careful political maneuvering. Any accusation suggesting otherwise is nothing but a deliberate fabrication, spread by certain individuals within my own court, who genuinely wish to see this entire treaty collapse. A murmur rippled steadily through the hall at this unexpected admission, and Charlotte felt a small measure of relief finally loosen the tight knot of anxiety sitting in her chest. Lord Bennet, despite his earlier fear and obvious weakness, had finally chosen to speak the complete truth publicly, regardless of the very real personal risk it carried for himself. "Who exactly within your own court benefits most from this treaty's complete collapse?" Nathaniel asked directly, his pale eyes fixed intently on Lord Bennet. Lord Bennet hesitated visibly, glancing nervously toward the other members of Rosefield's delegation, before finally answering carefully. "There are certain nobles among us who lost significant wealth and influence during the many years of conflict," he admitted. "Men who would clearly prefer continued tension between our two kingdoms, believing it offers them far greater opportunity to reclaim their previous standing and influence. I cannot name specific individuals with absolute certainty, my Lord King, but I have long suspected certain voices within my own council of secretly working against this peace from the very beginning." Nathaniel's expression hardened further, his gaze sweeping steadily across the assembled nobles with unmistakable warning clearly visible. "Let it be known clearly, throughout both our kingdoms, that any further attempts to spread deliberate falsehoods against my wife, or against this treaty, will be treated as a direct act of hostility against the crown of Draymore itself. I will not allow petty personal ambition to unravel a peace that has already cost both our lands far too much in blood and suffering already. The hall remained silent for a long, heavy moment, the full weight of Nathaniel's words settling firmly over everyone present within it. Slowly, one by one, even the most skeptical members of his own council began nodding, in reluctant agreement, finally recognizing both the genuine strength of his conviction and the sincere honesty behind Charlotte's own testimony. As the gathering slowly began to disperse, Charlotte felt Nathaniel's hand find hers, warm and reassuring despite the exhausting tension of that entire difficult morning. "You did remarkably well," he murmured quietly, meant only for her ears. "We did well together," Charlotte corrected softly. "I could not have possibly faced that entire hall completely alone." "You will never have to face anything alone again," Nathaniel said. "Not while I still draw breath to stand firmly beside you." Yet even as the immediate crisis within the Great Hall finally began to settle, Charlotte could not shake the uneasy, persistent feeling that whoever had orchestrated this entire scandal from within Rosefield's court would not simply abandon their ultimate goal after a single failed attempt. Somewhere far beyond the castle walls, hidden ambition continued quietly plotting its next dangerous move, patient and fully determined to succeed where this first effort had ultimately failed completely. News of the failed scandal reached Julian Crane 3 days later, delivered by a nervous messenger who clearly feared his employer's reaction far more than the long, cold ride through harsh winter weather that had carried him north and then back again. "The king defended her publicly, in front of everyone," the messenger reported, standing stiffly in Julian's private study. "Lord Bennet confirmed the marriage's full legitimacy before the entire Draymore Council, and openly suggested that certain members of our own court were actively working to sabotage the treaty from within." Julian's jaw tightened visibly, though he kept his expression otherwise composed and calm. Beside him, Simon shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing nervously toward the door, as though genuinely worried the very walls themselves might somehow be listening in. "Lord Bennet grows considerably braver than I honestly expected," Julian said finally. "Perhaps proximity to a giant northern king has restored some measure of backbone he had long misplaced entirely." "What exactly do we do now?" Simon asked nervously. "If suspicion has already turned toward our own court, continuing this particular campaign of rumors risks exposing our direct involvement entirely." Julian rose slowly from his chair and walked toward the window overlooking Rosefield's capital city, his mind already working steadily through possible alternatives. "Rumors alone were clearly never going to be enough on their own," he admitted reluctantly. "I underestimated how quickly the king would move to protect her, and how genuinely willing Lord Bennet would prove to be, risking his own position defending the truth so openly." "Then we simply abandoned the entire effort," Simon said, though his tone suggested he did not entirely believe his own suggestion as he said it. "No," Julian said, turning back to face the room fully. "We simply change our approach entirely. If mere words alone cannot successfully unravel this marriage, perhaps a more direct method will ultimately prove far more effective." "What exactly are you suggesting now?" Simon asked carefully, clear apprehension evident in his voice. "The entire treaty depends completely on peace, between our two kingdoms remaining stable and secure," Julian said. "If that fragile peace were to be deliberately disrupted through a different kind of incident entirely, an attack along the border perhaps, one that could be conveniently blamed on either side depending on how the story was ultimately told, the entire foundation of this marriage collapses, regardless of whether anyone actually believes the earlier rumors about Charlotte's supposed deception." Simon's eyes widened sharply with genuine alarm. "You are suggesting that we deliberately provoke open violence between our kingdoms." "I am suggesting we simply remind both kingdoms exactly why this endless war began in the first place," Julian said coldly. "A single carefully orchestrated incident, convincingly blamed on Draymore forces violating the treaty's specific terms, would force Rosefield's council to seriously reconsider the entire arrangement, regardless of the king's own personal feelings toward his new wife. This approach is considerably more dangerous than simply spreading rumors," Simon said, though his objection sounded noticeably weaker than before, the tempting promise of restored power evidently outweighing his lingering hesitation. "Everything genuinely worth achieving carries real danger with it," Julian said. "I did not survive the complete collapse of my own family's fortune during this war by avoiding difficult choices, Simon. I certainly do not intend to start avoiding them now, simply when true success finally sits within our reach." Meanwhile, back within Draymore Castle, Charlotte had begun settling steadily into a rhythm of genuine purpose within her new role, working alongside a group of castle stewards to thoroughly reform how grain reserves were distributed throughout the kingdom's poorer villages during the harsh winter months ahead. Nathaniel watched her work with quiet, growing pride, noting how quickly she earned the genuine respect of servants and officials alike through patience and real competence, rather than simply relying on the authority of her new title alone. "You have transformed more within this castle in a few short weeks than most seasoned advisors managed to accomplish in years," Nathaniel remarked one evening, as they shared a quiet dinner together within his private chambers. "I have simply applied what I already knew from experience," Charlotte said, though a small, genuinely pleased smile touched her lips at his sincere praise. "Hunger does not care about politics or borders at all. It only cares whether enough food actually reaches the people who need it most desperately. Lord Vane admitted to me today, quite reluctantly, that your reforms have already reduced complaints from 3 separate villages along the eastern border alone," Nathaniel said. "I suspect that particular admission cost him considerable personal pride to make." Charlotte laughed softly at that, a warm, genuine sound that had grown increasingly common since the tension of the earlier scandal had finally begun to properly settle. "Perhaps I should thank him personally for his reluctant honesty, regardless of how it was delivered." Their peaceful conversation was interrupted abruptly by an urgent knock at the chamber door, and Gareth entered without waiting for permission, his expression tight with obvious alarm that immediately silenced the easy warmth of that entire evening. "My Lord King," Gareth said urgently, "a rider has just arrived from the eastern border. There has been a serious incident." Nathaniel rose immediately from his seat, his relaxed posture vanishing instantly, replaced entirely by the sharp, focused attention of a seasoned commander, receiving urgent news of real danger. "What kind of incident exactly?" "An armed group crossed illegally into contested territory, near Millbrook Crossing," Gareth said. "They attacked a small trading caravan, killed 2 innocent guards, and deliberately left behind evidence suggesting Draymore forces were fully responsible for the attack." "Were Draymore forces actually responsible for this?" Nathaniel demanded sharply. "No, my Lord King," Gareth said firmly. "I have already personally confirmed that no patrol whatsoever was assigned to that particular region during the exact time of the attack. Whoever carried out this brutal assault deliberately left behind false evidence, specifically to implicate us." Charlotte felt a cold chill settle heavily over her, the pleasant warmth of the entire evening evaporating instantly, as the serious implications of Gareth's report finally sank in fully. "This is clearly connected to the earlier rumors," she said quietly. "Whoever spread those original lies about me has now moved on to something far more dangerous and violent entirely." "It would certainly seem so," Nathaniel said grimly. "A failed attempt to destroy this marriage through pure scandal, followed swiftly by an attempt to destroy the entire treaty itself through calculated violence instead." "Rosefield's council will demand answers immediately," Gareth said. "If this incident is presented to them as clear evidence of a Draymore attack, regardless of the actual truth, it could reignite full hostilities before we even have a proper chance to investigate the matter fully." Nathaniel's expression hardened into cold, controlled fury, though his voice remained remarkably steady and calculated throughout. "Then we absolutely must reach Rosefield's council before whoever orchestrated this incident has the chance to twist the entire narrative completely in their own favor. That would require traveling directly into Rosefield's own capital city," Gareth said carefully. "Given the current heightened tensions, that carries considerable real risk, my Lord King." "I am fully aware of that risk," Nathaniel said. "But allowing this entire treaty to collapse over a deliberate lie carries far greater consequences than any personal danger I might personally face by confronting it directly and immediately." Charlotte stepped forward, her voice steady, despite the fear tightening noticeably in her chest. "I am coming with you on this journey." Nathaniel turned toward her sharply. "Charlotte, if this incident was deliberately staged, specifically to destroy our marriage, and this entire treaty, traveling directly into Rosefield's capital, places you directly within reach of whoever is truly responsible for all of this. And remaining safely behind these castle walls while you face that danger entirely alone helps absolutely neither of us in any way," Charlotte countered firmly. "I know Rosefield's court far better than you possibly could, Nathaniel. I grew up navigating its complex politics, even as an outsider looking in from below. If someone within that court is actively working against us, I may recognize warning signs that you would otherwise completely miss. Nathaniel studied her for a long moment, clearly torn between his strong instinct to protect her completely and his growing genuine respect for her sound judgment and considerable courage. Finally he nodded, though visible reluctance remained clear in his expression. "You will remain close to me at all times throughout this journey," he said, "and you will trust my judgment immediately, without any hesitation whatsoever, should real danger arise along the way." "I trust you completely already," Charlotte said, and meant it fully, in a way that genuinely surprised even herself, given how recently this entire marriage had begun, as nothing more than a desperate act of protection for someone else entirely. As preparations began swiftly for the difficult journey ahead, Charlotte found herself standing once again at the very edge of uncertainty, much as she had on the original morning of her wedding, though this time, she did not face that uncertainty entirely alone. Whatever dangerous conspiracy had been set into motion against their fragile peace, she fully intended to face it standing firmly beside the man who had once been a complete stranger to her, and had since become something far more important than she ever anticipated when she first agreed to wear another woman's veil. The journey to Rosefield's capital took 2 full days, traveling steadily, along carefully guarded roads, with a small escort, chosen deliberately for both loyalty and discretion. Charlotte spent much of the journey watching the passing landscape in tense silence, memories of her old life mixing uneasily with the strange, unfamiliar weight of returning now as a queen, rather than the simple servant girl who had once quietly lived within these exact same borders. When they finally arrived at the gates of Rosefield's royal palace, the tension hanging in the air was immediately obvious to everyone present. Guards eyed their small procession with open suspicion, and word of their sudden arrival spread quickly through the palace corridors, drawing curious and clearly wary glances from nobles who had not expected the King of Draymore to appear so soon after news of the border incident had first reached the capital. Lord Bennet met them personally at the palace entrance, his expression a complicated mixture of relief and deep, lingering anxiety. "My Lord King, my lady," he said, bowing quickly and respectfully. "I did not expect either of you to travel here so swiftly after such news. I could not allow false accusations to spread unchallenged, while I remain safely behind our own fortress walls," Nathaniel said. "Where exactly does the council currently stand on this entire matter?" "Divided, I am afraid," Lord Bennet admitted quietly, leading them carefully through the palace corridors, toward the main council chamber. "Some genuinely believe the evidence found at the scene proves Draymore involvement in the attack. Others, myself very much included, strongly suspect the entire incident was deliberately staged instead. Unfortunately, the loudest voices currently belong to those pushing hardest for immediate retaliation." "Who exactly has been most vocal in demanding this retaliation?" Charlotte asked, her earlier suspicion sharpening quickly into focused attention. Lord Bennet hesitated visibly, glancing carefully around the corridor, before finally answering quietly. "Lord Julian Crane, primarily. He lost considerable wealth and social standing during the Long War, and has never fully supported this treaty from its very beginning." Charlotte exchanged a quick, knowing glance with Nathaniel, both of them immediately recognizing the name from Gareth's earlier reports about the individuals most likely to genuinely benefit from the treaty's complete collapse. The council chamber was already tense when they finally entered, nobles arguing loudly among themselves before falling into uneasy, watchful silence at the unexpected arrival of the Draymore king and queen. Julian Crane stood near the head of the chamber, his composed expression flickering only briefly with genuine surprise, before quickly settling back into practiced, controlled calm. "My Lord King," Julian said smoothly, "I confess I did not anticipate you would travel here personally, given the serious nature of the accusations currently before this council today." "I came precisely because the nature of these accusations is so serious," Nathaniel said, his voice carrying easily through the entire chamber. "I intend to see this matter fully resolved with truth, rather than convenient assumption alone. The evidence discovered at Millbrook Crossing bears markings entirely consistent with Draymore patrol equipment," Julian said, addressing the assembled council rather than Nathaniel directly. "It seems a perfectly reasonable conclusion to draw, given the specific circumstances involved." Reasonable, perhaps, if one conveniently ignores the fact that no Draymore patrol was actually assigned to that particular region during the time of the attack, Nathaniel countered firmly. My general has already confirmed this exact fact through detailed patrol records, which I have personally brought with me for this council's careful review. Gareth stepped forward, presenting a sealed scroll detailing precise patrol assignments and troop movements for the relevant dates in question, evidence that quickly drew murmurs of serious consideration from several council members previously uncertain about the original accusations. Julian's composed expression flickered again, more noticeably this time, though he recovered quickly and smoothly. Records can always be altered to suit convenient narratives, he suggested, though his voice carried noticeably less certainty than it had before. As can evidence deliberately planted at the scene of a crime, specifically to implicate an entirely innocent party, Charlotte said, stepping forward for the first time since entering the chamber. The council members turned toward her with visible surprise, clearly not expecting the young queen to address them so directly and confidently. "My Lady Queen," Julian said, his tone carefully polite, though his eyes had grown noticeably colder. "This particular matter concerns border security, a subject perhaps better left entirely to those with genuine military and political experience. This matter concerns the deliberate manipulation of two entire kingdoms into renewed conflict," Charlotte replied evenly, refusing completely to be intimidated by his obvious condescension. "And I have considerable personal experience recognizing manipulation, having recently survived an entire campaign of false rumors clearly designed to destroy this treaty through pure scandal, before whoever orchestrated that failed effort apparently escalated toward outright violence instead." A ripple of visible tension moved steadily through the chamber, several council members exchanging uneasy, worried glances with one another. Julian's expression hardened further, though he maintained his composed exterior with visible, growing effort. "Are you suggesting, my Lady Queen, that I personally bear some responsibility for these unfortunate events?" Julian asked, his voice deceptively calm despite the mounting pressure. "I am suggesting," Charlotte said, "that whoever benefits most from this treaty's complete collapse deserves careful and thorough scrutiny, and I have heard from multiple reliable sources that few individuals within this council stand to gain more from renewed conflict than yourself, Lord Crane." The chamber fell into stunned, complete silence, every single eye now fixed directly on Julian, whose careful composure finally began to visibly crack under the weight of this direct accusation. Lord Bennett, standing nearby, watched the entire exchange with barely concealed satisfaction, clearly relieved that someone had finally voiced the suspicions he had privately harbored for many weeks. "These are entirely baseless accusations," Julian said, his voice rising slightly, despite his obvious attempt to maintain full control. "I have served this council faithfully for many years, and I will not stand here accused of treason based on nothing more than convenient suspicion alone." "Then perhaps," Nathaniel said, his deep voice cutting cleanly through the rising tension with unmistakable authority, "this council should conduct a thorough and proper investigation before drawing any further conclusions, examining not only the evidence found at Millbrook Crossing, but also the recent rumors spread against my own wife, and any possible connections that might exist between the two matters entirely." Several council members nodded readily in agreement, clearly recognizing the reasonable nature of Nathaniel's proposal, even as Julian's expression darkened further with poorly concealed alarm. "I will personally lead that particular investigation," Lord Bennett offered, seizing this opportunity to demonstrate his renewed commitment to the treaty's continued success. "Every noble present will be expected to cooperate fully, including complete access to personal correspondence relevant to these recent events along the border." Julian's jaw tightened visibly, though he had little real choice but to agree, given the watchful attention now focused directly and entirely upon him. "Of course," he said stiffly, "I have absolutely nothing to hide from such a thorough investigation." As the council meeting finally concluded, tensions still simmering beneath a fragile surface of forced cooperation, Nathaniel guided Charlotte toward a quieter corridor away from the dispersing nobles, his expression a genuine mixture of pride and lingering concern. "You confronted him directly, in front of everyone," Nathaniel said quietly. "That was either remarkably brave or remarkably reckless of you." "Perhaps both, honestly," Charlotte admitted, though she did not regret her words in the slightest. "But someone needed to say plainly what everyone else in that chamber was clearly too afraid to voice aloud themselves. "You may have made a dangerous enemy today," Nathaniel said. "I believe I made that particular enemy the moment I agreed to take Amelia's place beneath that veil," Charlotte replied. "Today, I simply chose to stop pretending otherwise for anyone's comfort." Nathaniel studied her for a long, considering moment, something fierce and protective flickering behind his pale eyes. "Whatever comes next," he said firmly, "you will not face it entirely alone." Charlotte felt a steady warmth settle over her despite the lingering tension of that entire confrontation, grateful beyond words for the unwavering support of the man standing beside her, though she could not entirely shake the uneasy feeling that Julian Crane, now cornered and fully exposed, would not simply accept this defeat quietly, and that the true danger of this entire conflict had perhaps only just truly begun to unfold. Julian Crane did not sleep at all that entire night, pacing restlessly the length of his private chambers, while Simon watched nervously from a chair positioned near the cold, unlit fireplace. "The investigation will find real evidence eventually," Simon said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "The messenger who delivered our specific instructions to the men at Millbrook Crossing knows more than enough to implicate us both completely, if he is questioned properly. Then that messenger will simply need to disappear before he can be questioned at all," Julian said coldly, though even his usual confidence had begun to visibly fracture under the mounting pressure surrounding them. "You mean to have him killed?" Simon said, genuine horror creeping steadily into his voice. "Julian, this entire situation has already gone far beyond anything I originally agreed to, when we first discussed simply spreading a few rumors. You agreed to help restore our fortunes, our influence, everything this endless war and this treaty threatens to strip away from men like us permanently," Julian snapped angrily. "You do not get to suddenly grow a conscience now, simply because the path forward has become somewhat more difficult than you initially expected it to be." Simon said nothing further in response, though the obvious fear now evident in his expression suggested he was already carefully considering how quickly he might distance himself entirely from Julian's increasingly desperate and dangerous schemes. Unknown to either man, a servant girl, passing quietly near the corridor outside Julian's private chambers, had overheard enough of their tense conversation to fully understand its dangerous implications. She hurried immediately toward Lord Bennett's own quarters, delivering everything she had heard with breathless, genuine urgency. By the following morning, Lord Bennett stood before Nathaniel and Charlotte with grave, serious news. A servant overheard Lord Crane discussing specific plans to silence a witness connected directly to the Millbrook Crossing incident, he reported. "If this account proves true, it confirms his direct involvement beyond any remaining reasonable doubt whatsoever. We must act quickly now, before he has any real chance to eliminate this evidence entirely," Nathaniel said, already moving toward the door with the focused, immediate urgency of a commander accustomed to swift, decisive action. They found Julian already preparing to leave the palace grounds entirely, his expression tightening into cold fury, as guards, acting on Lord Bennett's direct orders, moved swiftly to block his path before he could reach the stables. "This is a complete outrage," Julian declared loudly, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard, as a small crowd of curious nobles and servants began gathering nearby to watch. "I have committed no crime whatsoever, and yet I am treated as a common criminal within my own kingdom's palace grounds." "A servant overheard you discussing specific plans to silence a witness connected to the border attack," Lord Bennett said, stepping forward with newfound authority and confidence. "If you are truly innocent, Lord Crane, you have absolutely nothing to fear from answering these accusations directly, before this entire council and these witnesses gathered here." Julian's eyes swept quickly across the gathering crowd, calculating rapidly, searching desperately for any possible avenue of escape from the trap now closing steadily around him on every side. Finding none available to him, his composed mask finally shattered completely, replaced entirely by open, desperate fury. "You would believe the word of a mere servant over a noble who has served this kingdom faithfully for decades," Julian spat angrily. "I would believe solid evidence," Nathaniel said, stepping forward, his towering presence somehow making the entire courtyard feel considerably smaller around him. "And evidence has consistently pointed directly toward your involvement, since the very beginning of this entire conspiracy, Lord Crane. False rumors spread deliberately against my wife, followed by a staged attack specifically designed to implicate my kingdom in a crime we did not commit. And now, apparently, concrete plans to silence a witness who might expose the entire truth completely. You cannot possibly prove any of this, Julian said, though his voice had begun to waver noticeably with genuine fear. I do not need to prove it entirely alone, Nathaniel said. I suspect, once your personal correspondence and private records are properly examined, exactly as agreed during yesterday's council meeting, the evidence will speak clearly enough, entirely on its own merits. Julian's gaze darted desperately toward Simon, standing frozen near the edge of the gathered crowd, clearly hoping his fellow conspirator might offer some kind of support or helpful distraction. Instead, Simon, recognizing immediately the complete collapse of their entire scheme, made a desperate, self-serving choice of his own. I only followed his direct instructions, Simon blurted out suddenly, stepping forward with visible panic written across his face. The rumors, the attack at Millbrook Crossing, all of it was entirely Julian's plan from the start. I wanted absolutely no part in silencing anyone. I swear this before this entire court. Julian turned on him with pure venom in his eyes, but before he could respond at all, palace guards moved swiftly to restrain him fully, acting on Lord Bennett's immediate authority. The crowd watched in stunned, complete silence, as the noble who had spent years quietly nursing his bitter resentment toward the peace treaty was finally, publicly exposed before the entire watching court. Take him immediately to the palace holding cells, Lord Bennett commanded, his voice steady, despite the shock still clearly evident on his own face. He will face formal judgment before this council, according to the full weight of our established laws. As guards led a still protesting Julian away from the courtyard, Charlotte felt the tension that had gripped her chest since first arriving in Rosefield finally begin to loosen considerably, replaced by a complicated mixture of relief and lingering unease at how genuinely close this entire conspiracy had come to succeeding completely. It is finally over, she said quietly, though the words felt strange after weeks of mounting danger and constant uncertainty. This particular conspiracy is over, Nathaniel corrected her gently, but the damage his lies caused will not simply disappear overnight, purely because the man responsible has finally been exposed publicly. Lord Bennett approached them both, his expression grave but genuinely resolute. The council will need to address this matter publicly, and quite thoroughly, to ensure both kingdoms fully understand the complete truth behind these recent events. I intend to make it absolutely clear that Queen Charlotte acted with nothing but genuine courage and loyalty throughout this entire difficult ordeal, and that any suspicion cast upon her character was purely the deliberate creation of a man seeking only to serve his own selfish personal ambitions. Thank you sincerely, Charlotte said, genuine gratitude clearly evident in her voice, for believing me completely, and for finally choosing real courage over simple convenience. I owe you far more than simple belief alone, Lord Bennett said quietly. You protected my own daughter when I personally proved far too weak to protect her myself. The very least I can offer you in return is the complete truth, spoken plainly and publicly, regardless of whatever it might cost my own reputation among certain members of this court. That evening, before departing back toward Draymore Castle, Nathaniel requested one final audience before Rosefield's full council, an audience that would ultimately prove far more significant than anyone gathered in that chamber initially anticipated it would be. Two kingdoms have suffered through years of entirely unnecessary conflict, Nathaniel began, his voice carrying clearly through the assembled hall, built upon assumptions and prejudices neither side properly examined closely. This treaty was meant to finally end that suffering, yet even after its signing, ambitious men within both our courts continued working tirelessly to unravel it, through lies, through calculated violence, and through the deliberate manipulation of two people who ultimately wanted nothing more than genuine, lasting peace for their people. He turned toward Charlotte, extending his hand toward her in a gesture that felt far more significant than the simple public displays of unity they had offered during earlier, more formal ceremonies. I stand before you all today, not merely to reaffirm this treaty, Nathaniel continued, but to declare, before witnesses gathered from both our kingdoms, that Charlotte Hart is my rightful and true queen, not because of noble blood, not because of any political convenience, but because of courage, integrity, and a heart genuinely devoted to the well-being of people far beyond her own personal safety and comfort. Any noble family, regardless of their particular heritage or standing, would be truly fortunate to claim her proudly as their own. The hall fell into respectful, complete silence. Several council members, exchanging thoughtful glances that suggested genuine reconsideration of opinions they had held since the earlier scandal first began circulating throughout their entire court. Let this be understood clearly, by both our kingdoms, Nathaniel continued firmly. True worth is measured through action and character, not simply through the circumstances of one's birth alone. I would far rather rule beside a queen who proved her devotion through genuine sacrifice than one who arrived bearing noble titles, but carrying empty conviction. Charlotte felt tears gathering steadily in her eyes, genuinely overwhelmed by the public strength of his declaration, by the way he had transformed a moment of potential scandal into a powerful statement about the very values he intended to build his entire kingdom's future upon. As the assembled nobles slowly began offering their formal acknowledgement, some genuine and heartfelt, others still hesitant but no longer openly hostile toward her, Charlotte understood clearly that whatever challenges still remained ahead of them, she and Nathaniel had finally weathered the storm that had threatened to destroy everything they had begun building together since that fateful morning when her veil had first been lifted inside a quiet, unassuming stone chapel. Spring arrived early that particular year, across the entire northern kingdom, melting away the last remnants of winter's snow from the castle walls and coaxing the first green shoots up through fields that had spent years growing nothing at all but ash and quiet sorrow. Charlotte stood in the castle gardens, watching a group of children play happily near the newly repaired fountain, their bright laughter carrying easily across the courtyard, a sound that had felt almost entirely impossible to imagine during her first uncertain days within these very same walls. Nearly a full year had passed since the chaos of Julian Crane's exposed conspiracy, and the peace between Draymore and Rosefield had only grown steadily stronger with each passing season since. "You look rather thoughtful today," Nathaniel said, joining her beside the fountain, his presence now as familiar and comforting as the northern wind that swept regularly through the castle grounds. "I was remembering how genuinely frightened I felt, standing in this exact garden during my very first week here," Charlotte said, smiling softly at the distant memory. "I could not have possibly imagined then how quickly this place would come to feel entirely like home to me." "A great deal has certainly changed since that time," Nathaniel agreed, watching the children play with quiet, genuine satisfaction. "Lord Vane himself suggested just last week that your grain distribution reforms should be adopted permanently across every single province in the kingdom, not simply the eastern villages you originally focused your efforts on." "High praise indeed, coming from a man who once openly doubted whether I belonged within this court at all," Charlotte said with a small, knowing smile. "People change their minds readily enough when presented with enough genuine evidence over time," Nathaniel said. "You have spent an entire full year proving, again and again, exactly the kind of queen this kingdom truly needed, regardless of how unconventional the original circumstances of your arrival happened to be." Their quiet conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a familiar carriage at the castle gates, and Charlotte's face lit up with genuine delight as she recognized the passenger stepping down carefully from within it. "Amelia," she called out warmly, hurrying across the courtyard to embrace her old, dear friend, who had traveled all the way from Rosefield for her very first visit since the wedding that had changed both their lives so dramatically. "You look absolutely wonderful," Amelia said, studying Charlotte closely with obvious relief and genuine happiness. "Truly, I worried constantly during those first difficult months, wondering whether I had asked far too much of you by allowing this entire deception in the first place." "You asked nothing of me that I did not offer willingly and gladly," Charlotte reminded her gently. "And besides, everything ultimately worked out far better than either of us could have possibly imagined on that frightened night we first devised this entire plan together." Amelia glanced toward Nathaniel, who had approached to offer a respectful and genuine welcome. "I confess, my Lord King, I once believed every single terrifying rumor that Rosefield's court whispered constantly about you. I am truly grateful beyond words to have been so thoroughly and completely mistaken about your character." "Rumors born from years of entirely unnecessary conflict rarely reflect any genuine truth at all," Nathaniel said kindly. "I am simply glad this treaty finally allowed both our kingdoms the real opportunity to discover that truth for themselves properly." Later that evening, as the three of them shared a warm dinner together within the castle's grand hall, easy conversation flowed naturally between old cherished friendships and new important alliances, a stark and welcome contrast to the tense, uncertain atmosphere that had once entirely defined the relationship between their two kingdoms. "Lord Bennet sends his warmest regards," Amelia mentioned partway through the meal. "He has become quite genuinely dedicated to strengthening this treaty, ever since Julian Crane's conspiracy was finally fully exposed. I believe he feels considerable lingering guilt over how easily he nearly allowed his own fear to compromise everything this important alliance was ultimately meant to achieve. He has more than adequately made amends through his continued and dedicated efforts since then," Charlotte said. "The new trade agreements he personally negotiated just last month have already begun improving conditions significantly for merchants and farmers throughout both our kingdoms alike." "And Julian Crane?" Nathaniel asked. "How exactly does his imprisonment fare these days?" "Quietly, and without much sympathy from anyone remaining within our court," Amelia said. "Simon's honest testimony, along with the additional evidence uncovered during the full investigation, left very little room for any remaining doubt regarding his complete guilt. Most nobles who once quietly shared his bitter resentment toward this treaty have grown considerably more cautious about voicing such dangerous opinions since witnessing the full consequences of his reckless actions." As dinner finally concluded and Amelia retired for the evening, thoroughly exhausted from her long journey north, Nathaniel and Charlotte walked together along the castle's outer wall, much as they had during those early, uncertain weeks of their marriage, though the comfortable silence between them now felt entirely different from the cautious distance that had once carefully defined their earliest conversations together. "Do you ever regret it?" Nathaniel asked quietly, watching the last golden light of sunset fade slowly across the northern hills before them, taking Amelia's place beneath that veil, knowing everything that single decision eventually led toward. Charlotte considered the question very carefully, though she already knew her honest answer without any real hesitation at all. "I have thought about that particular morning often," she admitted. "How frightened I felt, how uncertain the future seemed, standing in a chapel about to marry a complete stranger, the entire kingdom described as a terrible monster. I could never have possibly imagined then who you would actually turn out to be, or what our life together would eventually become for us both." "And now?" Nathaniel asked softly. "Now," Charlotte said, turning to face him fully, "I understand clearly that some of the most important moments in our entire lives arrive disguised as frightening uncertainty, and that real courage often simply means choosing to move forward despite that fear, trusting completely that whatever waits on the other side might prove far more meaningful than we ever originally expected it to be." Nathaniel reached up gently, brushing a loose strand of hair away from her face, the same tender gesture that had grown wonderfully familiar between them over the past full year, though it still carried the exact same genuine warmth it always had from the very beginning. "I am grateful, more than I can properly express in words, that fear did not stop you from stepping forward that particular morning," he said. "Whatever brought the two of us together, whether fate, simple coincidence, or purely your own remarkable courage, I do not intend to ever take it for granted, not for a single day." Below them, within the castle courtyard, the first bright stars of evening began appearing gently across the darkening sky above, the very same sky that stretched equally over both kingdoms now, no longer divided by suspicion and endless conflict, but slowly, steadily, growing united together through genuine understanding and hard-won mutual trust. Charlotte thought back to that frightened young girl who had once knelt beside a wounded stranger on a smoke-filled road, never once imagining that such a simple act of kindness would eventually reshape the entire destiny of two whole kingdoms. She thought of the terrified bride who had walked down a narrow aisle beneath a heavy veil, uncertain whether she was making the bravest choice of her entire life or the most dangerous mistake imaginable. Standing now beside the man who had once been nothing more than a frightening rumor, whispered constantly throughout her own homeland, Charlotte understood with complete and total certainty that she had made exactly the right choice, on a morning when everything about her future had seemed impossibly uncertain, and a single dropped veil had changed absolutely everything that followed from that moment forward. The kingdom of Draymore and the kingdom of Rosefield would carry the remarkable story of their giant Alpha King and his truly remarkable queen for generations to come. A story that began not with grand political ambition, but with quiet, genuine courage, proving clearly that even the deepest conflicts born from fear and misunderstanding could ultimately be healed through honesty, sacrifice, and the simple, powerful choice to trust one another completely, regardless of how uncertain that particular choice might initially seem at the time. And beneath the very same stars that had once witnessed a frightened, veiled bride step bravely into an unknown future, Nathaniel and Charlotte stood together now, not as strangers bound together merely by treaty, but as true and equal partners, forever grateful for the extraordinary path that had led them both toward a lasting peace and a genuine love neither of them could have possibly imagined on that cold, misty morning when everything between their two kingdoms finally began to change forever.